Good evening. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to Talking Point. My name is Faraz Patel. We'd like to thank you, the viewer, for staying with us. And of course, the news that we are still hoping for, that is the announcement of the cabinet and the possibility of a government of national unity has raised the eyebrows of many South Africans who are now wondering about how that cabinet would be looking like. Trade unions are also at the same time voicing concerns, admitting that should parties with some certain neoliberal ideas enter the economic cluster, they would frustrate the rights of workers. One of those parties is the South African Federation of Trade Unions. And joining me, I'd like to welcome its spokesperson, Trevor Shaku. Trevor, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us here on Talking Point on Hilaal TV.
Good afternoon, and thanks for having us.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. Trevor, I want to get just your comment first on reports that have been circulating that the Democratic Alliance, who have been very vociferous on wanting certain cabinet positions, especially in the economic cluster, are now looking like it's a possibility of them moving away from it. Even though it's not official, if this is the way things are going, would you see this as a supposed victory for the working class of South Africa?
Look, there's no victory for the working class of South Africa in this government in totality. Whether that government is constituted and the ministries and different departments are taken by the ANC or the DA or the IFP, it would not amount to any victory for the working people. The working people require a government that centralizes their well-being, and that government ought to be a workers' government that first and foremost wants to establish a socialist society and abolish a capitalist society, because capitalism is inherently exploitative, and therefore any government that has a political party which espouses a capitalist ideology is not good for the working people. So the DA, the IFP, the ANC, either of those parties, if they take the economic cluster departments, it does not mean anything. What we know is that there will be the further implementation of the neoliberal macroeconomic policies.
But Trevor, I mean, regardless of what happens, it's going to be them, because if you look at the other 7 parties that are there, it's not much is going to change with regards to potential change in the economic policy of the country. So then, of course, comes the question of the Progressive Caucus. And as we talk right now, the MK party is the official opposition, given the numbers that are there. Are you convinced that the MK party could be championing these rights of workers and, moving away from, the capitalism way of the economy in the way it functions within South Africa?
No, the MK party is a pro-capitalist party. What it is looking to establish is to establish a capitalism that is dominated by black people. So they are still not going to represent the overwhelming interests of the working people, because the working people would only be equitably benefiting from the economy if the economy would take a different route. So no matter what label they may give themselves, it is clear that what they are fighting for, it's a greater share by the black by the black aspirant bourgeoisie, rather than the change of the mode of production that we have. And no matter the changes to the ownership of the means of production, even if we were to skew that ownership to a black capitalist class, we will not deal with the fundamental contradiction of capitalism, which is the exploitation of workers. And the exploitation of workers obviously result in the concentration of wealth in fewer hands and the impoverishment of the overwhelming majority. So the MKP, even if it were to win, we do not think that we are going to see a greater distribution of wealth. We're going to, of course, see a different change in the ownership patterns. And that change in ownership patterns will not be a class-based distribution of wealth, but will be a racial change of ownership for the black aspirant bourgeois.
Trevor, then how does this change? Because at the end of the day, even though we look at the economics cluster, and in many ways they are the be all and end all in creating economic policy. Of course, you have civil service, you've got the citizens of South Africa, trade unions like yourself, who can push for the rights of workers, but ultimately the economics cluster has the final say. For this seventh administration, how much of a confidence is there that somehow, some way, the working class can still have a better life for themselves going forward? Because it's going to be a massive challenge in that regard.
Indeed, it is going to be a massive challenge. The only way the working class can try to save the little gains they've made in the past will be for them to ensure that they reorganize themselves into working class fighting organizations and be able to resist the neoliberal austerity, which is, of course, in the offing. ANC has already started implementing an austerity policy. For the past 10 years, we have seen the relentless implementation of austerity policies. And in fact, if you look at GEA in 1996, that on its own was placing of the South African economy and the South African developmental route into a neoliberal framework. Now, that has never changed. In fact, if anything, it has been intensified. So what we're going to see in this particular government is just the continuation of the intensified austerity policy, which is aimed at fiscal consolidation, that is to cut the provision, the cutting of spending for the provision of public goods and services. We're still going to see the structural reforms, which are going to concentrate ownership of state assets in the private sector, because they are trying to do what they call introduction of competition in the market. And this is in the communications, in energy, and in many other areas where the state is the monopoly of provision of goods, or of provision of services, or of the production of goods. So the only way the working class can be able to secure, or rather, the only thing the working class can secure would be that of ensuring that they protect the gains they've made in the past. But the government will be an anti-worker government, which is based on a neoliberal policy and which extols the continued exploitation of workers by ensuring that capitalism remains the mode of production.
Trevor, the SOEs, and I'm going to specifically touch on Eskom and Transnet, it's been a mixed batch of government saying, well, we will not allow, I'm talking about the current government, because we still don't have a cabinet that has been sworn in. The government led by the ANC saying, well, we do not want to privatize, but at the same time, there have been bailouts that have been occurring. From SAFTU's perspective, as the seventh administration is about to start, where do you see the faith of these SOEs?
Look, what you can be sure of is that if the multi-party government dominated by the ANC and the DA is the one that is going to rule us, and more likely is going to be the one, we're going to see the threat of the state-owned enterprises more and more. Already the ANC has started and completed the unbundling process, and it has completed that unbundling process and also the liberalization of the energy markets with the passing of the Electricity Regulation Amendment Bill. We have also seen the ANC government introducing the private sector in the Transnet corporation, where they want the private sector to handle some of the ports, especially in the east. We also have seen the introduction of private sector involvement in the production of fossil fuels across the value chain. I mean, we've seen the attacks on Petro SA. So those are the things. But we're also seeing that the ANC government has not only begun the process of privatizing some of these particular entities, but it has gone on to actually dismantle the monopolies some of these entities has. I mean, we have seen with the post office that dismantling has taken place. Of course, there's a little bit of a monopoly in the parcels of less than 1 kilogram, but a lot of those particular parcels are delivered by the companies who have been introduced in the mailing and post industry, where we know that the post office has previously held a monopoly. So if the ANC and the DA dominate this particular government, we are sure to find a government that continuously moves towards the dismantling of state-owned enterprises and the introduction of the private sector in those particular industries. And the worst part is that it is not just about the privatization of the provision of goods in those industries where government was previously a dominant factor, but we also see that government is actually playing a role in the background to incentivize the private sector by de-risking their investment. And the de-risking of the investments actually even renders the logic of privatization somewhat mad or crazy, because if you look at the energy provision, for instance, those independent power producers that are being introduced in the energy generation market to dismantle the monopoly of ESCOM, those particular IPPs are actually underwritten by the state itself. So it defeats the very purpose. Why do you privatize if at the end of the day, the state is still going to be the one that underwrites the private sector? So we are going to see much of that, because the IMF and the World Bank have told the ANC and certainly are telling the DA and many other capitalist parties which have gotten a piece of the so-called government of national unity, are advising them that the best way to go is about underwriting the private sector and dismantling the state monopoly in the provision of certain services and production of certain goods. And that is the reason why they have actually instituted a number of structural reforms to dismantle such a monopoly or such a domination of government in those particular industries. At the same time, requiring government to carry on its balance sheet the underwriting of the risks of those private sector companies.
Trevor, unfortunately, time is up. Thank you so much for joining us here on Talking Point on Hilaal TV. Much appreciated.
Thank you very much.
That's Trevor Shaku, spokesperson for SAFTU. After the break, we'll be speaking to Stats SA. In the non-agricultural sector, 67,000 jobs were lost in the first quarter of this year. Quite a scary number. I speak to Solly Mulai after the break.